Hello, everybody. We're delighted to be with you online today. So I'm Michelle, and yeah,
I'm Mairead.
and we're as Aona said, we're joining from the west of Ireland, where we work in the Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching in the University of Galway. And we were delighted to be in Krakow last year and meet some of your colleagues in ATH. And we're going to continue a conversation that we started that day with you today. So today we're going to talk about assessment. And Mairead and I have been working on many aspects of learning, teaching and assessment for many years now in Galway, but probably the biggest part of our work is working with academics on assessment. So we'll start with what we know about assessment. Well, one thing we do know is that assessment has been around for a long time. We see mention of assessment dating back to more than 2000 BC, when formal assessment systems were developed. They were developed really from early AD, particularly in Asia. And assessment was kind of an end piece of education. So it marked achievement or ability. And at that point, it was most often oral. In Europe, then, we see that assessment in the earliest universities was often oral, with written assessment beginning as a complement to oral examination, which is a bit different from what we see today. And that was, for example, in ancient Greece. The ability then to pass examination really across the world was a way to elevate your social status and contributed to social mobility. And to some degree, you could say that the same thing really is true today. By the early 1900s, then, there had been a move from predominantly oral assessment to predominantly written assessment. At this time, there was kind of a focus on standardization, with a desire to test students on the same content and under the same conditions so as to increase fairness. Multiple choice exams were actually developed at this time as a way to make assessment even fairer. So what this kind of shows us really is that over a period of around 4,000 years, there were very few changes in how assessment operated, very few major changes in how assessment operated. But as we move towards the latter part of the 20th century, we see a significant change in how assessment is viewed. Assessment becomes an area of scholarship and research by itself. There are now journals dedicated to assessment, entire conferences on assessment. And really, assessment has become a driving force behind what students actually learn, and in some cases, what is taught. An assessment, something that had started as a measure of certification or a measure or certification of achievement or ability, has become something much, much more complicated. There are so many demands on assessment, and it is required to serve many purposes, some of which are competing with each other. For example, assessment needs to be standardized, but it also needs to be authentic. It needs to be controlled, but it also needs to foster trust. There are as we say, so many competing things. And then if we think about it from the student's perspective, do they just see it as a tick box exercise? So I'll read out this quote this is from Reddit. It's I think it's worldwide, but it's from a professor's subgroup. And this professor says, "I teach intro psych, such a fun and interesting subject, but they don't even want to give it a chance. They just want points. I'm absolutely certain that their preferred scenario is to log into Canvas each day and click a button to redeem today's points, never having to listen to a single fact about psychology." And I don't know if this resonates with anyone, but I think at times we've all maybe felt this a little bit. So what does all of that tell us? I've spoken there for about 6 minutes now. What does it tell us? I think it tells us that assessment is complicated. So as I mentioned, Mairead and I spend a lot of time thinking about how to work with academics on developing their approaches to assessment. And we often discuss the fact that there are so many competing factors when we consider assessment. So at this point, I'm going to get interactive.
At this point, I'll jump in. So we'll hope that you will all participate in our VVox polls today. And it's great to see so many people on the webinar. We use VVox regularly because myself and Michelle do this kind of work with academics across our university and others. And we always like to get you involved when we're talking about assessment. So you have a couple of different options for how you can join. You can go to vvox.app and enter that ID, or you can just scan that QR code with your phone if you want to join from your phone instead. And once you get in, you won't see anything just yet because we haven't opened any polls just yet, but you will see on the top that there is a Q&A as well on there. It has two little chatting symbols opposite it, and that's a place that you can put in comments that we'll be able to see directly if you would like to. And I'm going to just publish an announcement on there as well now so that everyone can hopefully see that as they get in. So if we might give you just a minute to get on there on the VVox, and we can see that 19 of you are in already, which is great. And we will have the join information up again on later slides as well. So if you don't get in now, you will have another chance. But if you can just take down that ID and go to vvox.app, that would be great. We might maybe move on. Yep.
Yeah.
So our first, Michelle and I use a lot of scenarios when we're doing this work. So this will be our first one that we take a look at today. So this is Maria. She's teaching a class of 90 students in a second year module and or course, and her faculty are currently revising their assessments, and she's trying to choose a new final assessment task, and she's trying to figure out what she should do. So she's considering a few different things. She's considering a take-home project essay type assessment with just a single final submission. Or she's thinking about maybe a scaffolded written assignment, which has, stages and is marked along the way, but also has a final submission at the end. She has thought about the possibility of doing a group project where the final submission will be a presentation. She is considering still the more traditional, maybe final 2-hour written exam in an exam hall, proctored setting. She's also thought about interactive orals. She's heard about them, but she's thinking maybe a group interactive oral where each student is marked separately, but they're doing it in a group. Or maybe she should take the time to do an individual oral assessment that would cover the whole content of the semester, so that would have, students would have to be prepared on everything. Or maybe it's easier just to do an online assessment. So this is what she's thinking through at the moment. So what we're going to ask you to think about first, and we will open the first poll in just a minute. And I can still see that that we have 18 people in there. So if anybody else is able to join, we'll have the join information up on the next slide again. The first thing we're going to ask you to do is think about which of these options is most secure. Do you think? So most secure, and by that we mean that the students are least likely to be able to cheat on it in some way. So most secure. And you can see the join information is up there again. It's vvox.app, and there's the code that you need to put in. So you'll still be able to join if you haven't gotten in yet. And we do ask that you stay in this because we will be using the same VVox session for the rest of our webinar here. So if you can just stay in, and with the next poll as we need it will come up. So thank you to everyone who's in there right now. That's brilliant. It really helps us out if you're able to give your thoughts on these as we go along. So I can see that about half of you are in there, a little more than half have submitted. So we'll give you just another minute on this one to have a think through which you think is the most secure. And we'll be counting down in 10 seconds. We're going to close the poll. And so we'll go. So we're at 3, 2, 1. Oh, you almost. We're sorry. We're watching the number 18. There's 21 of you in.
Change the mind.
All
Okay,
right.
we'll move on. Yeah,
go.
let's see what you said.
Yep. Okay. So most secure. Most of you went with an individual oral assessment based on the content of the entire semester as your most secure. A few of you went with the final 2-hour written exam. Some went with the written assignments, and a few with the group projects. So I'm going to throw it out there if anybody's brave enough to come on, who went with any of the choices really, to talk about why you chose what you chose. Is there anybody who would come on mic and tell us why they made their choice? Olga.
Hi, thank you. I actually want to make a comment about this because I had a kind of dilemma last semester regarding assessment on a lecture. And I chose to do an individual oral assessment because I did believe that it was the best way to have students kind of avoid cheating. And I had 2 groups kind of taking a similar exam because it was an intro to social theory for the humanities. And one group, which were BA students, I gave them a written exam. So it was kind of like that, I guess, that option with the final 2-hour written exam. And the second group, they were MA students, and they got an oral assessment. And I felt like the oral assessment was a really good way to test their knowledge because they either knew the answers or they didn't, and they were able to kind of critically discuss the subjects that they had to talk about as well. So I don't know, I just think in practice, it's a really good way to test students' knowledge.
And did you wish, Olga, that you'd gone with the oral in the other one as well, or were you happy with the 2-hour written exam in the other setting?
I was happy with it. It was a multiple choice exam, and then there was one long answer question. And I think for the level that the students were at, it was okay, which is why I chose it. So I didn't regret it, but I think that the oral exam was great. It was time consuming, but it was a really good way to test their knowledge and also critical thinking skills.
Perfect. Thanks, Olga. How many students did you have in that module that you did the oral with?
A lot, 40. At least that's a lot for me. So it was about 40. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always an interesting one when we say what's a lot. It can vary vastly from one lecture to the next. So that's great. Thanks a million, Olga. That's a good example to share. Anybody else want to share their thoughts on why they chose one or the other here? Anybody brave enough to come in? Don't worry, there's going to be more opportunities, so steel yourself because we're going to have more polls to come in on. Eva?
Hi, nice to see you again. I remember you from the other project,
yes.
So I'm glad to be attending. But I'm not going to talk about my experience as a teacher assessing, but rather a student being assessed. But I remember the times when I was assessed individually on the content of the entire semester, and I remember that it required quite a lot of skills. Critical thinking and all the abilities I could use to prove that I know what I know. And the result was such that I really felt assessed well enough and fair enough.
Okay.
And there was no way to cheat, right? Because it was like a face-to-face situation. And sort of I would like to compare it with my experience as a teacher as well. But I remember that I got the knowledge of the skills of my students at the English department, by the way, when I was able to face them and talk with them and sort of sometimes prompt or sometimes help if I see that they were not doing well enough because they were stressed, etc., right? Because we know that such different conditions and different things influence what's happening during the assessment. So at least in this situation, I could influence that or maneuver with certain things or supervise certain things, right? Whereas if it were if it had been online, then the result might have been completely different, right?
Okay.
Or anything else. But so I believe that this face-to-face assessment is the one that is effective. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eva. And there's no right or wrong answers in these because in any situation you might have something that works better or worse depending on your learning outcomes, depending on what you're doing. I would say that there are issues with that take-home project essay with only one submission. We do see problems, especially if there hasn't been a lot of writing submitted throughout the semester by students. So we have run into problems with that one. But we also have, issues you have to consider with the oral assessment, the individual or group. You need to think about what you're asking. Are students going out and, do they have opportunity to tell other students what was asked in the oral? We know that in the final 2-hour written exam that we have the issue of these meta glasses now, where students might be wearing glasses that are smart glasses and it's very hard to tell. So there's always security issues. None of these are perfect solutions, but it's about choosing what you think is best for your situation right now. And Eva, you led us nicely into the next question we're going to ask you, which is the same scenario, but if instead we think about what's fairest for the students this time. So instead of what's most secure, what do we think is fairest for the students? So we'll ask you, and the join information is still there at the top. We've lost some of you, so if you can get back in there, vbox.app, and just it'll ask you for that ID code, that 196076550. That would be great. And it's just there at the top of the slide. That's great. I can see some of you getting back in there. So we'll give you just another minute to think about that one, which is fairest for the students. Okay. All right, we'll close it in 10 seconds, maybe a little bit more. Could see some of you are in there. Just getting in there now. All right. 3, 2, 1. Okay, Michelle, we might go.
Got to 20.
Yay. Okay. Interesting. So much more of a mix on this one. Last one, there was a clear kind of winner with that individual oral assessment, but a lot more of a mix here. So I'm not going to ask you to talk about the assessment that you chose here, but what I would like to ask is, how did you define fairest? So what were you thinking about when you were thinking about fairest here? Anybody want to comment on that? To tell us how you were thinking about fairest. What did that mean to you? Eva?
Hello. The fairest for me is the one that gives a chance, more chances to the student to work on the answer, to self-correct.
Okay.
And to be sort of, that does not put too much stress on the student. So the more secure, most secure environment.
Okay, and what did you think that was, Eva, in your choice?
It was
if you don't mind sharing.
Individual scaffolded written assignment marked in stages.
Okay.
So feedback, immediate feedback from the teacher, possibility, chance to self-correct, but in time. I mean, it's not just in front of just like individual oral assessment would be possibility of self-correction, but more stress. The option to do assessment in stages or lead to the final assessment in stages gives more chance to work individually, take more time and so on.
Okay, thanks, Eva. That's interesting. Anybody want to agree or disagree, or maybe had a different definition of fairest when they were? I see we have 2 hands up. Sorry, just let me.
Maybe Iona next.
Yep, yep. You're on mute there. You wanna?
I just think about the situation when the final grade or feedback or whatever really show the real knowledge of student. And it means that the external factor, like already mentioned, stress, situation, bad day or something like that, don't influence the assessment.
Okay. And which were you choosing, Iona?
The same.
The same. Okay, the same one. Monica, I saw you had your hand up there. Did you want to come in and tell us what you were thinking?
Yes. So I had similar reasoning to Ivona, although I picked a different option. So my idea was that the fairest for the student would be the type of assessment that the final grade corresponds the most to the actual knowledge of the students. And I was thinking about like standardized setting so that different students were put through exactly the same circumstances. That's why I wasn't sure about individual oral assessment, because in my experience, there's a lot of luck that comes into play. It may depend on the type of assessment, but for instance, as a student, I had situations when I was being examined and I just kind of got lucky. So the questions that the teacher came up with were the ones that I felt the strongest. But I might have had some blind spots or some areas that I didn't know so well, but I just happened to get lucky with it, right? And someone might not have gotten so lucky. So to me, this element that would be a little bit unfair, and the sort of more standardized exam settings allow it to be a little bit more fair.
Because you think that they get to ask maybe more of a spread of questions. Is that what you're thinking, Monica, maybe in a 2-hour written exam?
Yes, that's one thing. There's like more areas to cover, and there's like less subjective factor connected to the person-to-person experience, right? Because when you are assessing a student in an oral exam, there are other factors that may influence your ideas about their knowledge as a teacher, right?
Okay. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Monica. We'll take one more. Stanislaw has
thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation interaction. I have chosen the individual oral assessment. However, because I would rather put the stress for the fairest, means to present the knowledge acquired during the entire semester. As you might see, and most of people present knows that I am from the older generation. So for me, the stress is not that something which I would so much care about, because, well, if someone is learning systematically through the whole semester, then presenting that knowledge is not so much of the stress. If someone counts on luck, then there might be stress. What I would like to say, however, I presume that there will be more questions. I don't think that it is most effective way of checking the knowledge. However, what I would here choose, if possible, I would choose 2 options, because what I was doing usually is the written exam, preceded then by the oral exam, which allows also to dig into the places where the student who had some problems in the written, and then it can be opportunity to present that nevertheless with the written it was not so well addressed in the written section. It can be corrected during the oral exam. So
great.
Thank you.
Thanks. And that brings up a great point, which is that one of the recommendations around assessment is that we don't depend on only one type of assessment, that we do try to offer diverse assessment choices to students, whether that's a choice in the way that they're assessed or whether that's us using more than one assessment type. We might move on to the last one. I'll talk a little bit about this fairest while you're considering this. So this is our last question on this one, which is just which of these most closely resembles how you assess in your largest class? So just thinking about the biggest class you teach, and which one of these most closely resembles how you assess in that. We know it might not be perfect because we've only picked a set of examples. So the fairest question is one that we've come across as being a really interesting one to discuss because it can be quite different how people consider fair to the students. So some people think about which one is least likely to have students cheating on it as being also fairest to the students. Some people think about what's most closely resembling what the students are going to have to do outside when they graduate from university, and that it's fairest to prepare them for that. So some people like the group project or the group element because they feel like that's what students are going to have to do after they graduate, so we should be preparing them for that. Some people like the oral assessment. Some people feel like the final 2-hour written exam is fairest because students are all in the same conditions, same questions at the same time. But of course, we know from the literature that some students don't perform very well on the written exam. Even if they know the material at times. So, and so the suggestion of combining assessment types is a good one. So we'll give you just another 10 seconds here, and we're going to move on from this scenario now, this example. We've brought up all of the great ideas and topics that we like to hear from it with your comments. So thank you very much for coming on, Mike, and sharing that. They were all great. We'll do a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're finding this one harder, probably because it doesn't fit very well, maybe in some cases. So we might move on from this one. That's interesting that we see that the one that, for those who answered, that the final 2-hour written exam is closest to what you're doing. We understand it might be slightly different. Okay, we move on, Michelle, from this one. So what we're seeing with all of this is that we have this assessment balancing act. And we're always trying, we have all these competing demands of assessment, and we only have so much resources, time, space, available to us. So we asked Copilot to create an image for this. And this is what it created, and as many times as we tried to tell it that the competing demands of assessment would be heavier than the resources and time available to us because we don't have very many resources, Copilot could not take this on board. So we sent it numerous other messages to try to get it to fix the picture. It did switch them around, but still with our resources heavier than our competing demands of assessment. And then it added a pigeon for no apparent reason. So this is just a moment of levity. We tried to use some Gen AI in there, and it backfired on us. We wonder how many times that it does that for the students and whether they notice that or not, whether they would have noticed that the balance beam was not correct. So it is definitely a balancing act in trying to figure out our assessment. There's so many different elements, and we're always trying to make the best choice we can, right? For our students, for our situation, for the learning outcomes that we have, and it's hard. It's hard to do that. And then we can see that we're still depending on high stakes assessment, which actually there's no pedagogical reason behind the use of high stakes assessment. We use it because it's efficient, essentially. It's cost effective, it's practical, it's scalable, there's administrative convenience. It's not necessarily that there is actually a valid educational reason to be using high stakes assessment. And that was from a recent paper, 2024. So it's worth keeping in mind that all of the options that we gave you back there, maybe except for the staged written one, were all a version of high stakes assessment. It was one assessment that was, maybe determining how students were going to do in a module. And so it's always good for us to think about why we're doing things in a particular way. And often with assessment, it's because that's the way it's been done for quite a while. We might move on. We have Coimbra did a report in 2018, so 8 years ago now, which is hard to believe that 2018 is 8 years ago. But one thing they noticed was that they said that, given the variety we have in types of modules, formats, content, we have so much variety in our module design and our learning outcomes across disciplines. But we have a remarkable lack of variety in our assessment methods. They're incredibly homogeneous across European universities, and they said that's really quite remarkable given what variety we have in everything else to do with our teaching. Why are we so homogeneous in our assessment methods? And we can look there. We know we just had a very small snapshot, but it would seem that we probably still are to some degree, that we're still fairly dependent on that kind of high stakes end of semester final exam type assessment. And I know that some of us have moved back to that because where we might have experimented with other types of assessment, and now we feel like that's a secure option, which is not wrong, but it is interesting to note that that's the situation we're in. Okay. And then of course the big one, along came Gen AI, right? And now things have gotten much more complicated. We're being told from the media that we should be equipping students, right? We need to be teaching them how to use Gen AI. We heard it from our own Minister for Higher Education just this morning on LinkedIn. So we hear this message, and it's not wrong to think like that, and people may very well need to use Gen AI in jobs they go into. But the question, of course, is whether it's our job in our particular module, whether we should be using Gen AI in that situation. And for that, we can look a little bit at the research, and the research is telling us that Gen AI is not necessarily helping our students learn. So although they may very well need to use it when they go out into their careers, there's a big question as to whether they should be using it for their learning. And that's kind of that distinction. And we do have to think about that, about where is the appropriate place for students to use these tools? And is it appropriate in your module, given your learning outcomes? And we certainly are seeing some research that's coming out that just says we need to be careful. It's not necessarily allowing students to develop that deep thinking that they need to really struggle with ideas. And we can see this was from a Brookings report at the beginning of this year, which said that as far as they were concerned, they looked at over 400 studies across 50 countries. They had focus groups, they had interviews, and they currently were finding that the risks of AI were outweighing the benefits. So they were not recommending its use. Now that was across education at all levels. So it wasn't just focused on higher education. So we see these again, even in the microcosm of Gen AI having come in. Again, we're getting these mixed messages. We have these competing factors to consider. And of course, that's going to add to our own complications and our thinking about what to do. So we in another moment of seeing what Copilot and we did try some similars with ChatGPT. We thought the introduction of Gen AI was like throwing the cat among the pigeons, which is a very English phrase. And so we asked Copilot to create a picture of throwing the cat among the pigeons. And you can see the first one is a very afraid cat with pigeons that seem quite unconcerned, which is not the point of the cat among the pigeons. And then we asked it after a little bit to try to fix that, and it did finally make maybe a slightly bizarre looking cat and very worried pigeons. But it's interesting to note that only one of the pigeons has thought to perhaps maybe fly away, because clearly they could fly away and the cat can't, but that has not occurred to the rest of them yet. So it's, you know, it's worth thinking about whether you were the startled pigeons or the unconcerned pigeons in this situation. Maybe we were definitely the startled pigeons. We were a little bit thrown when this was first released in 2022 at the very end of the year in November, and yes, I would say I was a startled pigeon. I don't know, Michelle, what you would count yourself as, but I think perhaps also a startled pigeon.
Yeah, I think I was probably a startled pigeon as well. And this is probably where it got the pigeon in our earlier image as well. It stole from a previous conversation and said, well, they like pigeons. Let's throw a pigeon in on the balancing act. Okay, so we did say we would talk about the challenges and the opportunities, and you're probably wondering when we were going to get to those, seeing as we're 37 minutes in. So we will talk about some of the opportunities, given the kind of yeah, what did we think about after we were terrified pigeons? What did we look towards? Well, one of the things is, and so for Mairead and myself, as teachers ourselves, and in our role supporting learning, teaching, and assessment, the greatest opportunity we saw was the chance to think differently about assessment. We had spent about 2 years trying to get people to come to workshops on assessment. We wanted to look at all different aspects of assessment. We wanted to do big rethinks, but we found it so hard to engage people because they just could not find the time or the space. They're so busy. Everyone is so busy. And it was really hard to find a time, you know, to come and just really think about assessment. But all that has drastically changed now. So this is a big opportunity we see. So as we said, we spend a lot of time working with academics on assessment, and much more now than ever before. And in fact, next year, as part of our professional development programs in our university, we'll run a 10 ECTS professional development module on assessment, which for us 6 years ago was unthinkable that we would have the chance to explore assessment in such detail with academics. So the other thing we've done is we've also developed an assessment review toolkit that programs can use to take a big step back and think about assessment across their program. And again, it's an opportunity. It's that opportunity to really think. And then another thing we've developed in just the past maybe 18 months or so is we now have a learning community or a community of practice that focuses on oral assessment, and we meet fortnightly, and we have people from around the university that come and talk about oral assessment, which we see growing. Similar probably to our scenarios earlier, you know, it's starting to become a little bit more popular. And one of the lecturers that comes to that community of practice is Hannah. So Hannah is a lecturer in philosophy, and for a long time, the major assessment for Hannah's module was a take-home essay. She was very happy with this assessment. It gave students time to develop their philosophical thinking and develop their arguments, similar to comments we had earlier. But with the advent of Gen AI, Hannah was worried that essays were vulnerable to academic misconduct and could really no longer be seen as a true reflection of student learning if they were using Gen AI help to develop their essays. Now, in reality, we knew essays were already vulnerable because they were vulnerable to contract cheating. And that was something that we started to see a lot more of, even though it was probably always around. Myself and Mairead became a lot more aware of it during the COVID pandemic. But the response to that particular threat was slower than the response we saw to Gen AI. It's also worth noting then that the threat of contract cheating, that has not gone away. and it's even cheaper now than before. So there were lots of things that Hannah was thinking about. So what did she do? She decided to use this form of assessment that she had heard about in a seminar called interactive orals, which is slightly different to maybe your Viva type oral question and answer. As their final assessment, Hannah had groups of 4 students attend a 15-minute meeting with her, and they discussed a scenario that was based on the philosophy of art, which was kind of the main topic of their module. She was really happy that the assessment was more secure, and it still assessed the learning outcomes as her previous assessment had done, but she felt it was more secure. But the most surprising outcome for Hannah was that some students who she had noticed hadn't been performing well in previous modules, where the assessment was only written, they outperformed their peers when they were able to communicate their learning verbally instead of via the written word, which was really, really surprising. And she came to our community of practice, and she was so excited about this. So we're going to go back to Vivox now, and we just want you to think about your modules. And think about Hannah's experience that by changing her assessment, she saw students had learned when she had thought they hadn't previously. And we just want you to think, so you can join Vivox again, those of you who have dropped out, the same joining details. And we just want you to think, is it possible that there are students in your class who are doing poorly on assessment but have actually learned a great deal? And just a simple, yes, it's possible, or no, I don't think so. Okay, I'll just give you a couple more seconds because I do think we're probably tight for time here.
We might skip Claire, Michelle.
We'll skip Claire. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
let's have a look and see what she said. It is, yeah. So and this is one of our opportunities. This is one of our opportunities, and I think we probably all feel this, that there's always the possibility. On a flip side, it's worth thinking, does a good mark mean learning has happened? So this is just a quote from a podcast that we listen to on Dead Ideas in Teaching and Learning. And this particular student just thought about getting through the assessment, and then they've gotten their grade, and then they think back and go, actually, I'm not sure I learned an awful lot. So it's just worth thinking of the two sides of the story there. Okay.
Yep. And I've certainly had students where I was kind of shocked. I did a small study with a group of students, and I interviewed them after they did an exam for me, and I had students who had done really well in the exam and students who hadn't done as well. And one student who did really, really well in the exam, I taught maths for years, so that's what this was in. And one student who had done really, really well in the exam, when I talked to her about what she had done, how she had answered the questions, I realized that what she had done was memorize elaborate ways to approach the problems that had very little to do with the actual concepts that were being asked in the problems. So she actually hadn't learned what I would have thought she would have. But she had done really well in the exam, and it kind of shocked me. It changed the whole way that I thought about assessment and how I viewed exams and what students were writing. I realized I was reading a lot into what they were putting down that wasn't necessarily there. So we've looked at Hannah wanting to avoid the use of Gen AI, so moving away from her written assessment and looking instead at her at doing an oral. So, but we know that people look two ways at Gen AI. Some people are looking at it as something to be avoided, something that they don't want students to engage with, and often with good reason. But others are looking at the opportunities and thinking maybe this can make the student experience better. Maybe we want students to use Gen AI to some degree. So there's those two sides. So let's look now. Might go on to the next slide, at a scenario where students were allowed to use AI tools. They were given a written assignment. They were allowed to use AI tools. And this is again, we're going to ask you to get back into Vivox in a minute. So if you've dropped out, you might take a minute and get back in while I'm going through this. And so they were told they could use AI tools. They just had to tell the instructor, the lecturer, how they had used them. So different students approached the assignment in different ways. And we want you to look at these options and think about your own situation and whether you would have considered any of these students to have engaged in academic misconduct. So Alex said he found it hard to get started, and he asked ChatGPT to brainstorm on the topic. He read the output and then completed the assignment using that as a starting point. Greta felt more comfortable writing in Swedish, so she completed the assignment in Swedish and then used a translation tool afterwards. And she then read through it and changed the wording of the translation slightly, and then she submitted it in that way. And Jan struggles with writing. He has lots of good ideas for the assignment, and he knows what he wants to say, but it never quite seems to come out the way he wants it. So he made notes of his ideas. Then he asked Claude to answer the prompt using his bulleted ideas. So he gave all of his ideas in there and he said, now what would you do with that? Claude provided a response that incorporated most of his ideas, but it did miss a few. And the argument didn't sound quite the way that Jan had wanted it to. So he made changes so that the response reflected what he had intended, and then he submitted that. So if you can think about those, we can see that there's a few of you still in the Vivox, so we'll just ask you to think about those options for a minute. Would any of those students have, in your mind, have engaged in academic misconduct? If it was your situation, your class, and your students were doing these things, which ones would you have considered would any of them have engaged in academic misconduct? You can choose as many as you want, or none of them. So if you just take a minute to respond to that. So remembering Alex used it to brainstorm, Greta had used the translation, and Jan had his own ideas that he bullet pointed and put in and asked it to respond to the task, the assessment task based on those ideas. And so we'll go with 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. See what people think. Okay. So a good number of you would have said that none of them engaged in academic misconduct. Some people thought Alex. Of the 3, more people thought Jan. And this is one that's worth thinking about more. We don't have time to talk about it hugely here, but think about what it is you want your students using Gen AI for. So I always feel a bit sorry for Jan. We do this scenario a lot, and most people think that Jan, if they're going to choose one, that Jan is the one who's engaged in academic misconduct. And I feel a bit sorry for him because he did have his own ideas. He had them. He wrote them down. You know, they weren't written in kind of the answer format, but he had bullet pointed them, written them down, and then he asked Claude to come up with an answer based on his ideas. Whereas Alex actually had no ideas of his own. He asked ChatGPT to give him the ideas, and then we don't really know how much work he did himself after that. You know, it says he completed it with that as a starting point, but we don't really know what he put into it. So it's worth kind of remembering that just because we think students are going to use these tools in a particular way, that doesn't mean that they will. So it's worth being clear with them about what we think will help their learning and not. And then it's also good to remember that we don't always view these things the same way. So students will be in lots of different classes with lots of different lecturers, and they won't necessarily know what's okay or what's not okay. So Michelle, I might turn back over to you here. maybe?
Yeah, sure. So really, the way we see it is this is just the beginning. Gen AI has disrupted things for us, but let's look at where we can go with this. It's a chance to really think deeply about our assessment, to think about the purposes of assessment. What is a particular assessment for? If it's certification, if it's that we really need to be able to stamp the piece of paper and say, yes, a student has achieved these learning outcomes, then we might assess in a particular way. But then there are still other ways that we used to assess before that we can still do, but we might use them in slightly different ways. So we might use them as more formative ways as scaffold a student's learning, similar to the conversation we had earlier, to give them those waypoints, to give them the feedback. So we just need to think a little bit differently. We also feel that it's also an opportunity, similar to what Hannah saw, that assessing in a slightly different way actually included students that previously weren't included in that academic piece. They were learning, but they weren't able to demonstrate it because of the assessment that was being used. If we can open up our assessment a little bit more, give a little bit more choice, we might be including people who were previously unincluded. And through no fault, it was just we were doing things the way things were done or the way it was expected to be done. And we're in Galway, we're going to take a big look at program assessment. We're going to take those big steps back and look at assessment across programs so the students are getting lots of choice, lots of different ways to show their learning. And then just one other thing that's worth thinking about is the marks and what do the marks mean. So I think we're probably well over time. So I'm going to leave it there. And we will circulate the slides. We'll send the slides, so you're very welcome to have a look at them. And for now, we will just say dziękuję and thank you very much for your time and for engaging with us. We really enjoyed it, and hopefully we do have time to take some questions.